Grimdark is a hard genre to do well, especially in the video game format. You have to tiptoe a fine line between too gratuitous and too censored, and it's a line that most Warhammer games fail to balance properly. Outside of classics like Dawn of War 1 and Fire Warrior to a certain extent, most games made in the Warhammer IP seem too washed down to properly capture the essence of the 40k universe. Most come across as mobile cash grabs like the Space Wolf game, or strategy games that appear too bloodless like Chaos Gate and Mechanicus. The original Space Marine game, released in 2011, is a Warhammer game that I believe manages to thread the proverbial needle successfully, having levels of gore and gloom that seem accurate to the setting without coming across as overly edgy. It is this, I believe, which is the reason for Space Marine's status as a cult classic in the Warhammer video game circle. The gameplay, reminiscent of Gears of War, serving as the post-child of how to do effective Warhammer 40,000 gameplay. Now I may be getting ahead of myself here. If you don't know what Warhammer even is, well, this video is not long enough to cover all of it, but the basics are, humanity is fucked, beset on all sides by unknowable alien horrors and incomprehensible demons from beyond the mortal veil. However, not all hope is lost, as the Space Marines exist, standing as beacons of defiance that hold against the tide of abominations. Also, the leader of humanity is a giant psychic space zombie who eats thousands of people every day to keep screaming, which is necessary for humanity to survive, but that's for another video. Also, if you don't know what Grimdark is, it's defined by Wikipedia as a subgenre of speculative fiction with a tone, style, or setting that's particularly dystopian, amoral, and violent. Back to the game, however, with the release of Space Marine 2 coming up on September 9th, I thought I'd have a look back at what made the original Space Marine such a cult classic, dissecting the mechanics and the story, and then coming to a list of what exactly makes a Grimdark game good. Of course, to start, we must cover the most obvious reasons as to why it was good, that being the The main draw of a game like Space Marine is, of course, the gameplay. To be fair, I think that at least in 90% of cases of games, the primary draw is always the gameplay, but that's a topic for another video. The gameplay of Space Marine, however, is deceptively simple for what it is. It's an almost too basic hack and slash setup, with the game being in the third person as you fight two separate enemy factions. Shush, cats. Shush. Shush. The Orcs, a brutal green warlike faction that's just stereotypical Orcs if they were football hooligans, and the Forces of Chaos, traitors to humanity who have surrendered themselves to the powers of the Dark Gods. The two factions create an interesting dynamic depending on who exactly you're fighting. For example, when fighting against the Orcs, it's more of a horde-like game, like Dynasty Warriors, with occasional special enemies like the Weird Boys who use mind powers to try and kill you. This gameplay style changes when facing the Forces of Chaos, as they primarily use cultists who are like Orcs but more squishy, and corrupted versions of the player's race, the Space Marines, who serve as an interesting change in pace as they are significantly more tanky than the average enemy, and often play a lot like the player. Oh yeah, Chaos can also summon demons, but that's neither here nor there. Back to how the gameplay is presented, my favourite part of how the game's combat works is how they choose to implement health. The player character seemingly has regenerative abilities, albeit through the confines of the gameplay system, forcing the player to execute enemies to regain health, accompanied by a cool animation. It amps up the feeling that you are an unstoppable force of rage and defiance and fits perfectly to the game's more lighthearted tone. The player character, Dimitri and Tyus, is accompanied by the characters Sidonus and Leandros. Fuck that guy, you'll understand later. Which serves as accompaniment for the combat. Not especially useful, but it helps add to the immersion of actually being a Space Marine captain in charge of a squad. The game doesn't feature progression by way of a skill tree that you would expect to see in a more RPG-based game, instead focusing progression on your equipment, as you start with only a combat knife and a bolt pistol, a relatively weak weapon, but as the game carries on you build up your arsenal to weapons that include the heavy bolter, a powerful machine gun that rips through hordes like nothing, a melter gun, an almost shotgun type weapon that shoots at the temperature of the sun to incinerate the enemies of the Emperor, and the las cannon, a sniper rifle type weapon that is capable of massive armor penetration. But before we conclude, it's time for the obligatory shill. If you're enjoying this video so far, please consider liking and subscribing, as the engagement that would provide would help a small channel like mine considerably. Thank you regardless, and let's return to the video. Alright, I think that's enough of the gameplay covered. Now let's cover the second most important aspect, at least in my opinion, the There will of course be spoilers past this point, so if the gameplay section sparked your interest at all, then go and play the game. It is quite old at this point, so it can feel quite dated, but if you have an Xbox 360 lying around or got it on PC with like fucking Games of Gold or something, or however you do it nowadays, it is worth a go. This won't be a complete synopsis of every part of the game, however, so even if you watch this section, you should still be able to play the game. That aside, let's get into this. The game begins displaying a screen of the Adeptus Mechanicus discussing the fall of a Forge World Graia to the Orcs, with high-ranking Imperial commanders trying to decide what course of action they shall follow, mainly because the loss of the industry found on Graia has severely impacted the war effort of the region. After some discussion, it is decided that the second company of the Ultramarines, Space Marines, shall be dispatched to reinforce the planet. The game's action then begins, starting you off as Captain Titus, Captain Demetrian Titus as I stated earlier, starting in a gunship with your two teammates Leandros and Sidonus. You are there to survey the situation in the atmosphere, and you quickly discover that an Orc cruiser is blocking any attempts at landing, and it must be dealt with. Titus, as the absolute badass that he is, decides that the best course of action is to dive from the gunship wearing a jetpack suit to land onto the cruiser and to destroy it after landing. Leandros, a young space marine, disagrees with this course of action, citing the Codex Astartes, this set of rules that space marines are meant to listen to, but that most of the Ultramarines dogmatically follow. But of course, Titus brushes off these concerns and jumps off the gunship. You land on the Orc vessel, beginning to slaughter a horde of Orcs, but soon you encounter Orc war boss Grimskull, the leader of the Orc forces that are currently occupying Graia, and in the ensuing fight, you manage to damage the Orc's vessel's engines and power systems, and you crash onto the surface of Graia. What follows is a section of fighting on the planet separated from your squad, which you soon meet up with, of fighting through the ruins of what was once Industrial Zone 82, until you meet up with 2nd Lieutenant Mira of the 203rd Cadian Shock Troops Regiment. It is here where you're informed that the rest of the Imperial Guard, the normal human forces, cannot land due to the Orcs commandeering a massive defense cannon that was once made by the humans to defend the planet but is now being used against them. It is here that Titus starts to realize that the Orc war boss encountered earlier isn't as straight-minded as many other Orcs, and that he actually can think tactically, which, if you know anything about the Orcs, they're not known for being smart. They're quite stupid, you know. However, you agree to deal with the gun emplacement, and you order Lieutenant Mira to just concentrate on the guard's defenses, as the already limited amount of guard on the planet need to foster their defenses more than try and attack anything. The squad set off once more into enemy territory, and you penetrate the defenses of the gun emplacement, successfully managing to place a melter bomb, a powerful explosive device, onto a shell destined for the barrel, causing the gun to explode when the Orcs attempt to fire it, permanently crippling the cannon. This action allows more of the 203rd Cadian to start landing on the planet and starts to shift the war effort against the Greenskins. The pressure now being relieved off the struggling Imperial Guard, the Astartes proceed to make their way to the Ajaxus Manufactorum, a huge plant dedicated to building massive weapons of war known as Battle Titans, to ensure that the Orcs cannot seize any of these god machines. Whilst inside, the Space Marines find a servo skull, a human skull stuffed full of machinery intended to be used for menial tasks, like delivering messages, that contains a message from a man called Inquisitor Drogon. The Inquisition is a secretive force of agents dedicated to rooting out any treachery, sometimes possessing authority that surpasses that even of the Space Marines. The message claims that the Orcs are nearly in possession of a Warlord-class battle titan that was currently being assembled in the factory, a weapon of immense strength. To seek more answers, Titus and his men look inside the factory for Drogon, who they manage to find, who informs them that the Orcs cannot, under any circumstances, be permitted access to the power supply of the factory, a powerful, warp-based artifact. The warp in this case is the domain of the Chaos Gods, a realm of unknowable madness and unfathomable energy. The Inquisitor leads Titus and his men to this artifact, with Titus retrieving it, a small cylinder cloaked in potent blue energy, but it results in a deadly explosion. Titus, however, manages to survive as he is just that guy, but he is temporarily separated from his squad. This doesn't last long, however. As they reunite and Titus and his men return to the Inquisitor after the explosion, Drogon is now shocked, claiming that Titus should not be currently alive and that the power source is capable of establishing a direct connection with the vastness of the warp. The Space Marines continue despite this warning, meeting up with Lieutenant Mira once more and assisting her with the defenses that the guards are failing to hold, which, to be fair, they are just normal humans with flashlights, essentially. Seeing the desperate situation, Drogon informs Titus of a weapon called the Psychic Scourge that could be used to wipe out the Orcs by using the power of the warp. Titus agrees to this plan, even despite the obvious dangers. He proceeds to Drogon's lab, flying in on Imperial Valkyries, massive flying weapons of war. Getting into the facility, passing the automated security, and solving interruptions by the Orcs that render the weapon temporarily useless, Titus then places the power source into the weapon's core, returning to Drogon. The Astartes watch as Drogon fires the weapon at a distant collection of Orcs in the nearby spire. It, of course, however, backfires tremendously, and instead of ridding the world of the Orcs, it instead rips open portals to the warp all across the Forge world. This culminates in the room in which Titus is in being flooded with chaos demons just before Titus and the war boss clash once more. Eventually, a massive Chaos Space Marine sorcerer enters the world, named Nemeroth, as he reveals that Drogon had been his pawn the entire time, a demon residing inside the Foe Inquisitor. Before the sorcerer could retrieve the power source, Grimskull returns, charging into the Chaos Space Marine, sending them both tumbling over the railing, seemingly into the abyss. Titus escapes, using the cover that the Greenskin has provided, quickly formulating a plan to use the Warlord-class Titan that they protected earlier to destroy the spire, where Drogon's weapon and the massive warp portal are now located. His plan is put into effect, but Leandros expresses concerns over Titus's connection to the warp, which he attempts to bring up, but Sidonus quickly silences him. Moving on after that, they return to the Titan factory, slaying equal amounts of Orcs and Chaos forces until they are ambushed once again by Orc Warboss Grimskull, saying that
You think you can walk out of here with that sparkle thing? I'm Boss Grimskull! This whole planet is mine!
However, after a tough battle, Titus blows the Orcs' heads to pieces. With the head of the snake cut off, the Orc forces rapidly retreat, fighting amongst themselves for who will lead the Orcs after Grimskull, leaving the Chaos forces as the last remaining obstacle on Graia. Titus powers up the Titan, using the artifact as its power source, the squad protecting it while it moves into position and allowing it to launch a massive strike at the spire, collapsing the warp portal.
Now.
Titus gives the power source to Sidonus, entrusting him to make it to the extraction point, while he and Leandros remain behind to hold off the waves of chaos. This seems to work until Sidonus is ambushed and killed by Nemeroth, who then goes on to explain that Drogon has been his puppet for some time, specifically so he could draw the power source to him, claiming that he will now ascend to greater heights because of this. Titus, now thoroughly pissed after the death of one of his best friends, carries on with Leandros, fighting through Chaos forces with both the help of his own Ultramarines 2nd Company and also the newly arrived help of the Blood Ravens chapter of Space Marines, who you might recognize from Dawn of War. Oh my god! Upon reaching the spire, Titus boards a gunship and reaches the spire using a jump pack, a seeming callback to the start of the game. He fights his way to the top of the spire, confronting Nemeroth, who claims that due to Titus's clear connection to the warp, he is destined to fall to corruption. Titus, like the chat he is, refuses the mere idea, proclaiming that his only destiny is to slay the enemies of the Emperor. At this point, Nemeroth had been extremely buffed by the powers of the warp, but that did not stop Titus, who launched himself at the Chaos Marine, sending them falling off the side of the spire and plummeting towards the surface of the planet. Titus uses all of his pent-up rage and skills to beat the sorcerer in physical combat, smashing into his skull. Nemeroth's body melting back into the warp, he returns to the surface victorious, the artifact in tow. The day seemed good. Too good. As Titus sits in the gunship that he used to return, his rest is short-lived, as Space Marines of the Black Templars arrived alongside an Inquisitor who was accompanied by Leandros. Leandros had reported Titus for corruption, as no one can touch chaos artifacts like that and be truly clean, according to him at least. Titus refutes the allegations, but chooses to enter inquisitorial custody to prevent the people from under him being investigated by the Inquisition, which is normally a fate worse than death. They are, depends on the Inquisitor, but a lot of them are puritanical, they're insane. The game concludes with Titus after saving an entire planet in chains, in a gunship surrounded by people who believe him a traitor. Leandros looking on, feeling guilt at turning in his own captain. Well, that was a long but necessary recap of the first game's story, with Titus after this going on to serve in the Death Watch, one of the militant arms of the Inquisition, but that is a story for a different time. Now, to actually answer the question I set up at the beginning, what makes Space Marine not only a good story, but a good Grimdark story? I believe I have narrowed down the reasons as to why. The first, obviously, is a simple but effective story, featuring a twist that is adequately foreshadowed, and two antagonistic forces that complement each other and don't overpower each other, especially with Grimskull also managing to serve as a sort of comic relief. The overarching message of the story also complements the genre perfectly, with the small sliver of hope in the setting, the actions of Titus saving the world overshadowed by the dystopia in which it takes place, with even the world being saved only serving as a momentary respite. The combat serves as another vehicle for this, with the visceral and brutal combat serving as a perfect encapsulation of the line that Grimdark media has to tread, with being fun as it is, while it's not overly gratuitous or edgy. This idea is also shown through the atmosphere of the world of Space Marine, as it is extremely true to the setting, whilst not featuring overly muted colours, allowing the vibrancy of the setting to flourish while still accentuating elements that are true to the setting. Overall, to sum it up, Space Marine succeeds as both a game and a grimdark piece of media because it doesn't take itself too seriously. It's a perfect mix of stupidly over-the-top combat and corny story that blends perfectly together to make a fun and engaging story that shines with grimdarkness. Somewhat of an oxymoron, but it is accurate. The game stands as a true testament to game design in the early 2010s, and especially as an example of a good Warhammer game. And with the sequel right around the corner, let us hope that it reaches the same heights. And once again, thanks for watching. This video is shorter, but honestly there was only so much I could say about the game. Oh yeah, make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. I mean, you don't have to, but I would appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one.